The November sun hung low in the Texas sky, casting long shadows across the rolling plains of the Double H Ranch as Daniel Harper completed his morning inspection of the fence line. At 34, Daniel was a man shaped by solitude and hard work, his weathered hands and sun-darkened face telling the story of 15 years spent building something meaningful from nothing more than determination and stubbornness. The ranch had been his father's dream, passed down to Daniel along with a mountain of debt and the kind of responsibility that aged a man before his time. Now, after years of careful management and backbreaking labor, the Double H was finally beginning to prosper. The cattle were healthy, the land was productive, and Daniel had earned the grudging respect of his neighbors in the small community of Cedar Ridge. What he hadn't earned was companionship. Daniel's dedication to the ranch had come at the cost of personal relationships, leaving him isolated in a way that had become both familiar and increasingly difficult to bear. He told himself that solitude was the price of success, that a man couldn't build something lasting while being distracted by romantic entanglements. But as Daniel rode along the eastern boundary of his property, checking posts and wire for damage from the recent storms, he found himself thinking about the empty house that awaited him at the end of each long day. The silence that had once seemed peaceful now felt oppressive, and the ordered routine of his bachelor existence was beginning to feel more like a prison than a choice. It was this melancholy mood that made Daniel almost miss the splash of color that shouldn't have been there among the brown grass and weathered fence posts. His horse, a steady mare named Belle, noticed at first, her ears pricking forward with interest as she caught sight of something unusual ahead. Daniel urged Belle closer, his heart beginning to race as the splash of color resolved itself into something that made his blood run cold. A woman lay crumpled near his fence line, her dark blue dress spread around her like spilled ink, her long brown hair covering her face like a curtain. She was motionless, and from Daniel's position in the saddle, he couldn't tell if she was breathing. Dismounting quickly, Daniel approached with the caution of a man who had learned to expect trouble on the frontier. But as he knelt beside the woman, caution gave way to urgency. She was young, probably no more than 22 or 23, and clearly in distress. Her face was pale and drawn with exhaustion, her breathing shallow and labored. More concerning was her obviously pregnant condition, probably 7 or 8 months along based on the curve of her belly beneath her worn dress. "Ma'am," Daniel said softly, gently touching her shoulder. "Can you hear me?" The woman stirred at his touch, her eyelids fluttering as she struggled toward consciousness. When her eyes finally opened, Daniel found himself looking into the darkest brown eyes he had ever seen, eyes that held a mixture of fear, pain, and desperate hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Please don't send me away." "Easy now," Daniel said, his voice instinctively gentle despite his shock at finding her. "You're safe. What's your name? What happened to you?" The woman tried to sit up, then immediately fell back with a soft cry of pain. Daniel could see that she was exhausted, probably dehydrated, and clearly in no condition to be lying on the cold ground. "My name is Sarah," she said, struggling to form the words. "Sarah Mills. I've been walking for 4 days. I ran out of food, ran out of water. I saw your fence and thought maybe." "How long since you've eaten?" Daniel asked, already knowing the answer from her hollow cheeks and the way her clothes hung loose everywhere except around her swollen belly. 3 days, maybe 4, Sarah admitted, shame coloring her voice. "I had some money when I started, but it ran out in the last town. No one wanted to help someone like me." Daniel understood immediately. A pregnant woman traveling alone was automatically suspect in frontier society, assumed to be either a runaway wife or worse. Such women found few friends and little charity in communities that valued respectability above compassion. "Sarah," Daniel said carefully, "where's your husband?" "Your family." The question brought tears to Sarah's eyes, and she turned her face away from him. "There is no husband," she said quietly. "There's no family. There's just me and—" She placed a protective hand over her belly. "Just me and the baby." Daniel felt something shift in his chest at her words. Here was a woman alone in the world, carrying a child that would be born into shame and poverty through no fault of its own. The injustice of it stirred something protective in Daniel's nature, something that had been dormant during his years of solitary focus on the ranch. "Can you stand?" Daniel asked. "We need to get you inside, get some food and water into you. You can't stay out here." With Daniel's help, Sarah managed to get to her feet, though she swayed alarmingly and had to lean heavily on his arm for support. The simple act of standing seemed to exhaust her further, and Daniel realized she was in worse condition than he had initially thought. "I'm sorry," Sarah said as Daniel helped her toward his horse. "I don't mean to be a burden. I just didn't know where else to go." "You're not a burden," Daniel replied firmly, "and you don't need to apologize for needing help." Getting Sarah onto Belle required careful maneuvering, with Daniel having to support most of her weight while she struggled to maintain her balance. By the time they reached the ranch house, Sarah was barely conscious, slumping against Daniel's chest as he guided the horse home. Daniel's house was modest but well-built, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room that reflected his practical nature and lack of feminine influence. As he helped Sarah inside and settled her on the sofa in the sitting room, Daniel found himself seeing his home through her eyes, noting the absence of decorative touches, the purely functional furniture, the general atmosphere of a place where someone lived but didn't quite make a home. "I'll get you some water," Daniel said, moving toward the kitchen, "and some soup if you think you can keep it down." As Daniel prepared a simple meal, he found his mind racing with questions and concerns. Sarah was clearly in no condition to travel, and her pregnancy meant she would need careful attention and medical care. But more than that, she would need protection from a society that was quick to judge and slow to forgive women in her situation. When he returned with a cup of water and a bowl of soup, Daniel found Sarah sitting up straighter, some color returning to her cheeks now that she was warm and safe. She accepted the water gratefully, drinking slowly but steadily. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes directly for the first time. "I know this is irregular, taking in a stranger, especially someone like me." "Someone like you?" Daniel asked, settling into the chair across from her. "A woman with no husband, carrying a child that—" Sarah's voice trailed off, and she looked down at her hands. "I know what people think about women in my situation. I know the assumptions they make." Daniel studied her face, noting the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet dignity she maintained despite her circumstances. "What people think doesn't matter to me," he said quietly. "What matters is that you needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. But your reputation—" "My reputation is my own concern," Daniel interrupted gently. "Sarah, you're safe here, for as long as you need to be." As Sarah slowly ate the soup, Daniel found himself thinking about the practical implications of his offer. A pregnant, unmarried woman staying at his ranch would certainly cause talk in Cedar Ridge. People would make assumptions about their relationship, about Daniel's character, about the nature of his assistance. But looking at Sarah, noting the way she ate with careful restraint despite her obvious hunger, the way she kept one protective hand on her belly, the quiet gratitude in her expression, Daniel realized he didn't care what people thought. This woman needed help, and he had the means to provide it. What he didn't yet realize was that in helping Sarah, he would discover something he hadn't known he was looking for. The possibility that his carefully ordered, solitary life might have room for something he'd never dared to hope for: a family. 3 days after finding Sarah collapsed on his land, Daniel faced his first real test of resolve when Doc Peterson rode out to the ranch in response to Daniel's request for medical attention. The elderly physician had been serving Cedar Ridge for nearly 20 years, and his weathered face had seen enough human drama to make him pragmatic about most situations. But even Doc Peterson raised his eyebrows when he saw Sarah. "Daniel," the doctor said quietly as he completed his examination of Sarah in the spare bedroom, "this young lady is in remarkably good health considering her ordeal, but she's going to need careful attention over the next few weeks. The baby could come any time now. I understand. Document whatever she needs." Doc Peterson closed his medical bag and fixed Daniel with a steady look. "Son, I need to ask you something, and I want a straight answer. What's your relationship with this girl?" I found her collapsed near my fence line 3 days ago. She was dehydrated, starving, and pregnant. I brought her home because it was the right thing to do. And that's all. Daniel met the doctor's eyes steadily. That's all. She needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. Doc Peterson nodded slowly. I believe you, Daniel. But you need to understand that not everyone in town is going to be so charitable in their assumptions. A pregnant, unmarried woman staying at a bachelor's ranch. People are going to talk. Let them talk. It's not that simple, and you know it. Mrs. Whitmore has already been asking questions about why you sent for me, and she's not the type to keep speculation to herself. By tomorrow, half the town will know you've got an unmarried pregnant woman living in your house. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Mrs. Whitmore was Cedar Ridge's self-appointed moral authority, a woman who seemed to take particular pleasure in exposing and condemning the perceived sins of others. What are you suggesting, Doc? I'm suggesting you think carefully about what you're getting yourself into. That girl in there is vulnerable, and association with her could damage your standing in the community. You've worked hard to build your reputation here. After Doc Peterson left, Daniel found Sarah sitting up in bed, her face pale but alert. She had obviously heard at least part of the conversation, and her expression was a mixture of gratitude and worry. I'm causing problems for you already, aren't I? Sarah said quietly. Daniel pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down. The only problem is that some people in this town have nothing better to do than mind other people's business. Daniel, I know what my presence here means. An unmarried pregnant woman, a bachelor rancher. People will assume the worst. Sarah's voice grew smaller. They'll think the baby is yours. And if they do, it could ruin you. Your reputation, your business relationships, everything you've worked for. Sarah looked down at her hands. I should leave. As soon as I'm strong enough, I should move on. Where would you go? Daniel asked gently. Sarah, you're 8 months pregnant with nowhere to go and no money. You can't just wander the countryside hoping for charity. I can't stay here and destroy your life either. Daniel was quiet for a moment, wrestling with a decision that had been forming in his mind since Doc Peterson's warning. It was crazy, impractical, and would certainly shock everyone who knew him. But as he looked at Sarah, noting the quiet strength in her dark eyes, the way she worried more about his reputation than her own desperate situation, Daniel realized it might also be the only solution that would protect them both. Sarah, he said slowly, what if there was a way for you to stay that wouldn't damage either of our reputations? What do you mean? Daniel took a deep breath. What if we got married? The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language, her eyes wide with shock. Daniel, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. Think about it. If we're married, your presence here becomes respectable. The baby would have a name, legal protection. You'd have security, and I'd have. Daniel paused, struggling to articulate feelings he barely understood himself. I'd have a family. But marriage it's a sacred bond, not a business arrangement. You can't marry someone out of pity. Is that what you think this is? Pity. Sarah studied his face carefully. Isn't it? Daniel considered the question seriously. At first, maybe it was just compassion for someone in trouble. But Sarah, these past 3 days, having you in my house, knowing that someone was waiting when I came in from the fields, it's made me realize how empty my life has become. Daniel, I'm not asking you to love me, Daniel said quickly. I'm not even asking for a real marriage in the intimate sense. I'm offering you protection, respectability, and a home for you and your child. In return, you'd give me companionship and the chance to be a father to a child who needs one. Sarah was quiet for a long time, her hand resting protectively on her belly as she considered his proposal. What about your future? What if you meet someone you truly want to marry? Sarah, I'm 34 years old. If I was going to meet that someone, I probably would have by now. I've been alone for so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have another person in my life. These 3 days have reminded me. And the baby? You'd really claim another man's child as your own? That child is innocent of whatever circumstances led to its conception. If we marry, he or she would be legally mine, with all the rights and protections that come with the Harper name. Tears began to stream down Sarah's cheeks. You would do that? For a stranger? You're not a stranger anymore, Sarah. You're the woman who's been sharing my home, my meals, my conversations. You're thoughtful, intelligent, kind, and stronger than you know. Any man would be lucky to call you his wife. Even carrying another man's child, especially then, it shows the kind of courage and love you're capable of. Sarah wiped her tears with the back of her hand. Daniel, if I agree to this, and I'm not saying I am, what would you expect from such a marriage? Honesty between us, partnership in running the ranch, companionship, and maybe, if we're both fortunate, friendship that could grow into something deeper with time. And if it doesn't, if we remain essentially strangers sharing a name, Daniel had considered this possibility extensively. Then we'd still have built something worthwhile, a safe home for your child, a solution to both our loneliness, and a partnership based on mutual respect. Sarah closed her eyes, and Daniel could practically see her weighing the impossible choices before her. Stay and marry a kind stranger who offered security but not love, or leave and face an uncertain future with a newborn child and no resources. The townspeople will still talk, Sarah said finally. They'll count the months, make assumptions about when the baby was conceived. Let them. We'll know the truth, and that's what matters. Daniel, I need you to understand something about me, about the baby's father. Sarah's voice grew quiet. He was a married man. I was working as a seamstress in his wife's shop, and he convinced me that he cared for me, that he would leave his wife. When I told him about the baby, he gave me $50 and told me never to contact him again. Daniel felt anger surge through him at the callous cruelty of a man who would seduce and abandon a young woman so completely. Sarah, that doesn't change anything about my offer. If anything, it makes me more certain that you and your baby deserve better than what you've received so far. You really mean it, don't you? You'd marry me knowing all of this. I mean every word. Sarah was quiet for another long moment, then slowly nodded. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Daniel. I'll marry you. As Daniel reached across the space between them to take her hand, both of them felt the weight of the commitment they had just made. It wasn't love that bound them together, but something that might prove just as strong. Mutual need, respect, and the desperate hope that two lonely people might find happiness in the most unlikely of circumstances. The wedding took place 5 days later in the small parlor of Daniel's ranch house, with only Doc Peterson and his wife Martha as witnesses. Reverend Collins had agreed to perform the ceremony despite his obvious reservations about the haste of the arrangement, and his stern expression throughout the brief service made it clear that he viewed the union with considerable suspicion. Sarah wore a simple dress that Martha Peterson had altered to accommodate her pregnancy, a pale blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes and gave her a dignity that transcended the unusual circumstances. Daniel had never seen her look more beautiful, and as they stood together before the minister, he felt a stirring of something deeper than the practical arrangement they had agreed upon. Dearly beloved, Reverend Collins began, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and ceremony, we are gathered here today to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. As the familiar words washed over them, Daniel found himself studying Sarah's profile, noting the way she held herself with quiet grace despite the obvious discomfort of her advanced pregnancy. She had been honest with him about her past, about the circumstances that had led her to his ranch, and her courage in facing both her situation and their unconventional solution impressed him more than she probably realized. Daniel Harper, the Reverend continued, do you take Sarah Mills to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Daniel said clearly, meaning the words more than he had expected. Sarah Mills, do you take Daniel Harper to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live? I do, Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The kiss that sealed their union was gentle and brief, but Daniel felt something pass between them in that moment. Not love, perhaps, but the beginning of a bond that went beyond their practical arrangement. After the ceremony, As they shared a simple meal with their witnesses, Daniel watched Sarah interact with Martha Peterson and marveled at her natural grace and intelligence. Despite her circumstances, she carried herself with a dignity that made Daniel proud to call her his wife. "Mrs. Harper," Martha said warmly, "you must let me know if you need anything as your time approaches. I've delivered my share of babies over the years, and I'd be happy to help." "Thank you," Sarah replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. I'm not sure what to expect. This is all so new to me." "First babies are always frightening," Martha said kindly. "But you have a good husband now and a safe home. That makes all the difference." As evening fell and their guests departed, Daniel and Sarah found themselves alone together as husband and wife for the first time. The weight of their new relationship settled over them like an unfamiliar garment, and neither seemed quite sure how to proceed. "Sarah," Daniel said gently, "I want you to know that nothing has to change between us just because we're married now. I meant what I said about not expecting, about this being an arrangement of protection and companionship." Sarah nodded, but Daniel caught something in her expression that suggested the subject was more complex than either of them had anticipated. "Daniel," she said slowly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course. When you offered to marry me, you said it would give you a family. Did you mean that? Or were you just trying to make me feel better about accepting your help?" Daniel considered the question carefully. "I meant it. Sarah, I've been alone for 15 years, ever since my parents died. I threw myself into building this ranch because it gave me purpose, but I never realized how empty that purpose felt until you came here. And the baby? You really want to be a father to another man's child. That baby is going to be born a Harper," Daniel said firmly. "He or she will never know anything but love and acceptance from me. The circumstances of conception don't matter. What matters is that we have the chance to give this child a good life." Tears began to stream down Sarah's cheeks. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Yes, you do," Daniel said, moving closer to take her hands in his. "Sarah, you made a mistake trusting the wrong man, but that doesn't make you less worthy of respect or love. You're brave, intelligent, and kind. Any child would be lucky to have you as a mother. And any woman would be lucky to have you as a husband," Sarah replied softly. "I know this isn't the marriage you probably dreamed of." "I stopped dreaming of marriage years ago," Daniel admitted. "I convinced myself I was too set in my ways, too focused on the ranch. But these past few days with you here, Sarah, you've made this house feel like a home for the first time since I built it." They sat together in the lamplight, hands linked, both processing the magnitude of what they had committed to. It wasn't the romantic beginning either had imagined for marriage, but there was something solid and comforting about their honest acknowledgement of what they were building together. 2 weeks later, Sarah went into labor on a crisp December morning while Daniel was repairing fence posts in a north pasture. When he returned to the house for lunch, he found her gripping the kitchen table, her face pale with pain and concentration. "The baby," she said simply, and Daniel's world shifted on its axis. The next 12 hours tested every reserve of strength and courage they both possessed. Martha Peterson arrived to assist with the delivery, and Daniel found himself playing a supporting role in the most profound drama of creation he had ever witnessed. Sarah's courage throughout the ordeal amazed him. She faced each contraction with quiet determination, never complaining, never losing faith that everything would work out. When their son finally arrived, just after midnight, his strong cries filling the house with the sound of new life, Daniel felt something break open in his chest. As Martha placed the squirming, red-faced infant in Sarah's arms, Daniel experienced a rush of protective love so powerful it left him speechless. "He's perfect," Sarah whispered, tears of exhaustion and joy streaming down her face. "Daniel, look at him. He's absolutely perfect." Daniel approached the bed slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the tiny person who was now, legally and emotionally, his son. The baby had Sarah's dark hair and what appeared to be her delicate features, but as Daniel watched, the infant opened his eyes and looked directly at him with the unfocused but somehow knowing gaze of the newly born. "Hello, son," Daniel said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world. What should we name him?" Sarah asked, looking up at Daniel with exhaustion and love shining in her eyes. Daniel had been thinking about this question for weeks. How about James? After my father. James Harper. James Harper, Sarah repeated, testing the name. I love it. James Daniel Harper. As Daniel gently touched his son's tiny hand and felt those perfect fingers curl around his own much larger finger, he realized that what had begun as an act of compassion had become the foundation of the family he had never dared to hope for. He was a husband now, and a father, and the woman beside him was no longer just someone he had rescued. She was his wife, his partner, and the mother of his child. In the quiet hours of early morning, as they marveled over their son and began to understand the depth of the commitment they had made to each other and to this new life, both Daniel and Sarah felt the first stirrings of something that went beyond gratitude or convenience, something that might, with time and care, grow into the kind of love that made a marriage not just legal, but real. Spring arrived at the Double H Ranch with a burst of wildflowers and new grass, and with it came a transformation that went far beyond the changing season. 6 months had passed since James's birth, and the tiny infant had grown into a bright, alert baby whose smile could light up even Daniel's most challenging days. More importantly, the tentative partnership between Daniel and Sarah had deepened into something neither had dared to hope for when they first spoke their vows. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching Daniel work with a young colt in the corral while James napped peacefully in the cradle Daniel had crafted during the long winter evenings. The sight of her husband's patient, gentle manner with the skittish animal never failed to move her, just as his tenderness with James had gradually worn away the last of her reservations about their unconventional marriage. The sound of approaching hoofbeats drew Sarah's attention to the road, where she could see Mrs. Whitmore riding toward the house with a determined expression that usually meant trouble. Sarah's heart sank. Despite the passage of time and the obvious respectability of the Harper household, Cedar Ridge's moral authority had never quite accepted the circumstances of Daniel and Sarah's marriage. "Sarah," Mrs. Whitmore said without preamble as Sarah met her at the front door, "I need to speak with you about a matter of some delicacy." "Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. Would you like some coffee? This isn't a social call." The older woman's eyes swept over Sarah with obvious disapproval. "They've been talking town about you and your situation. Some folks are saying it's not right. A man claiming another child as his own, pretending that baby is legitimate when everyone knows the truth." Sarah felt a familiar surge of protective anger, but she kept her voice level. "Mrs. Whitmore, James is my husband's son in every way that matters. Daniel has never treated him as anything less than his own flesh and blood. That may be, but the boy will grow up knowing the truth eventually. What kind of life is that for a child built on deception?" "There's no deception," Sarah replied firmly. "James Harper is exactly who we've raised him to be, a beloved son in a loving family." Before Mrs. Whitmore could respond, Daniel appeared in the doorway, having heard the raised voices from the corral. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic of the conversation, and Sarah felt grateful for the solid support of his shoulder against hers. "Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel said with cool politeness, "is there something I can help you with? I was just explaining to your wife that there are concerns in town about the irregularities of your family situation." Daniel's expression hardened. "What irregularities would those be?" "Daniel, please don't pretend ignorance. Everyone knows that child isn't yours by blood. Some folks think it's admirable that you've taken him in, but others worry about the precedent it sets, about what kind of message it sends to young women who might think they can solve their problems by finding a convenient husband." "Mrs. Whitmore," Daniel said, his voice deadly quiet, "James is my son. Not adopted, not taken in, my son. And if anyone in town has a problem with how I choose to raise my family, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly." After Mrs. Whitmore left, clearly frustrated by her inability to shame either Daniel or Sarah into acknowledging wrongdoing, Sarah found herself shaken by the encounter. She had thought the worst of the gossip and judgment was behind them, but apparently some people would never accept their family as legitimate. "I'm sorry," Sarah said as they sat together on the front porch, James playing contentedly on a blanket at their feet. "I know this reflects badly on you, and it's all because of me." "Sarah, stop." Daniel reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with the natural ease that had developed between them over the months. You have nothing to apologize for. Mrs. Whitmore's opinions don't matter to me, and they shouldn't matter to you. But she's right about one thing. James will grow up hearing whispers, knowing that people question his legitimacy. Then we'll make sure he also grows up knowing how much he's loved, how wanted he is, and how proud we are to be his parents. Daniel's voice was firm with conviction. Sarah, I've watched you with him these past 6 months. You're an incredible mother, and I'm proud to call myself his father. Daniel, Sarah turned to face him fully, her heart racing with words she had been afraid to say. These months, living here with you, building this life together, I need you to know that what I feel for you isn't just gratitude anymore. Daniel's hand tightened on hers. What are you saying? I'm saying that I love you, Sarah said quietly, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of courage and vulnerability. I know this marriage started as a practical arrangement, but somewhere along the way, it became real for me. You became real for me. Daniel stared at her for a moment, then cupped her face gently in his free hand. Sarah, I've been in love with you for months. I just didn't know if it was fair to tell you, given how we started. Why wouldn't it be fair? Because you married me out of necessity, not choice. I didn't want to pressure you into feeling something you might not naturally feel. Sarah laughed softly, tears beginning to stream down her cheeks. Daniel Harper, you are the kindest, most honorable man I've ever known. How could I not fall in love with you? Their kiss was different from the brief, ceremonial one they had shared at their wedding. This was a kiss of recognition, of two hearts finally admitting what had been growing between them through months of shared responsibilities, quiet conversations, and the intimate daily rhythms of family life. When they broke apart, James looked up at them from his blanket and smiled his brilliant, toothless grin, as if he approved of this development in his parents' relationship. So what happens now? Sarah asked, her forehead resting against Daniel's. Now we stop pretending this is just a convenient arrangement, Daniel said with a smile. Now we admit that we're a real family, built on real love, and we stop caring what anyone else thinks about how we got here. That evening, as they sat together in their parlor after putting James to bed, Sarah marveled at how naturally their life had evolved. Daniel read aloud from a book of poetry while Sarah worked on a quilt, and the domestic peace of the scene felt like everything she had never dared to dream of during those desperate weeks when she had been alone and afraid. Daniel, Sarah said, setting aside her needlework, do you ever regret it? Taking in a stranger, marrying someone you barely knew? Daniel looked up from his book, his eyes soft with love and contentment. Sarah, finding you on my land was the best thing that ever happened to me. You didn't just give me a family. You gave me a purpose beyond just surviving. You gave me a reason to build something beautiful instead of just something functional. And you gave me hope when I had none, Sarah replied. You gave me and James a home, a name, a future. But more than that, you gave us love. As spring turned towards summer and their first year of marriage approached, Daniel and Sarah Harper settled into the rhythm of a life built on the strongest possible foundation. Not just passion or convenience, but genuine love, respect, and shared commitment to the family they had created together. James thrived in the warmth of their love, growing strong and happy under the care of parents who had chosen each other and him with deliberate intention. And if gossips like Mrs. Whitmore continued to whisper about the unconventional beginning of the Harper family, Daniel and Sarah no longer cared. They had found something rare and precious, a love that had grown from compassion, been tested by adversity, and emerged stronger than either had thought possible. In a world that often seemed determined to tear people down, they had built something beautiful together, a home, a family, and a love story that proved the most unexpected beginnings could lead to the most extraordinary endings. Standing together on their front porch as the sun set over the Texas plains, with James babbling happily in Sarah's arms and Daniel's arm around her waist, they looked out over the land that had brought them together and felt nothing but gratitude for the journey that had led them home to each other.